After completion, the Chinese had their own jokes. The gate of doubt, the pressure of suspicious patterns or not. Here we're in the right angle cross of consciousness, the 63, the 64, the 5, and the 35. Everything about the logic process begins with the question, and the question is always rooted in doubt, and this 63rd gate is the gate of questioning. Remember that as we have seen in the format energies, that in the format lies all kinds of possibilities of depression, that here in the relationship between the head center and the ajna, in these pressurized channels, is that what's being pressured is anxiety in the ajna system. That is, that the mind operates out of an anxiety or out of a basic fear. That is, the fear that it will not be understood, the fear that it will not know, or the fear that it will not be able to make sense out of things. And at the transpersonal level, the fear that one cannot not share or empower the other with such recognition or such concepts. So the 63rd gate, like the 61 and the 64, carry with them potential madness or collective madness, and the 63rd gate is the gate of paranoia. And without the ability for the question to be answered, then of course the paranoia just grows. You know, this is the gate of conspiracies and all kinds of stuff. Absolutely essential inspiration. You see, everything within the collective, in order for it to be secure as a basis for our future, has to be challenged logically. Even if it's outlandish, even if it's bizarre, even if it's absolutely incredible. It is only through understanding that we get a common security. And so doubt is an instrument for that common security. To question things, to challenge the patterns. And remember, this is pattern-oriented. In the spiral of life, all ends are beginnings. The Chinese joke. This gate 63, which is the second to last gate being called after completion. You know, this is a wheel. It's like today we will come to an end at the 36, but of course that's not an ending place. That's just a place where we stop. The first line, composure. The sun exalted, and of course since the sun is exalted, you know this is going to have impact as an incarnation cross. It would eliminate the detriment. The quality of personality where achievement is accepted with equanimity and where continued development is allowed to take its natural course. Acceptance of achievement, but doubt whether continued development will take place. Now, this is one of the things to understand about the very basis of logic. You know, even though you can do 1 and 1 equals 2, built into the logic system is enough doubt that even though you know you got that, you're still going to have to check it again. This is the inspiration at its very best for us to understand that no formula, no matter what that formula is, any formula with any pretense of being logical, must be tested over and over and over again, even when it's verified. Because the verification says nothing. It simply says this is a viable pattern. But you have to keep on verifying it because mutation can always take place. And that the security of the whole is rooted on constant confirmation that mutation hasn't taken place, so that the collective can be secure. So it always has to be tested. Mars and detriment, a tendency and achievement to immediately seek new goals at the risk of destabilizing what has already been accomplished. The pressure and achievements to still doubt one's capacities and to immediately seek new goals. In other words, one question is always going to lead to another. Always. Always. After all, this is a lower trigram, first line. Introspection. The real question for the 63-1 is, what's a good question? What question can really provoke an answer that can lead to an opinion that becomes a detail that can be experimented and shown to be of value to humanity? And that's what it's about. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of useless questions that float around. However, because of the very nature of how logic works, they're all necessary. Think about what that's like. You don't know that there's an answer. That's the fourth gate at the other end of the channel. These are just questions. And the questions that are there as an inspiration, these are always questions about the future, about tomorrow. And of course, they're always creating that anxiety. Most of us are conditioned to give inner authority to our minds, to relieve ourselves of the anxiety. And of course, it just creates greater anxiety because the mind is not capable of controlling the nature of the life or its direction and is never its inner authority. So all that pressure, all of that anxiety that's sitting up there, can I find an answer? Is there an answer? Can be very disturbing if you're turning that in on yourself. The mind has no inner authority. You know, it's the great enemy, the moment that you give it that inner authority. You know, your life becomes a disaster, and you cannot possibly be yourself. It's very difficult for people that have pressure gates in the mental system to let go of thinking that if they can only come up with the answer for themselves, what I will do tomorrow because of this, that, and that, then just being themselves. You see, your minds are for others. My mind is for you. It's not for me. I know that. I don't pay any attention whatsoever to what my mind tells me I should or should not or must have or could have done. That would drive me crazy. It did drive me crazy for a very long time. I can say those things to you as a teacher doing this. This is giving my mind its outer authority. Your minds all have outer authority for me and are useless for you like it's useless for me. So if you have these mental gates and you've got all this pressure and anxiety, understand, don't turn it in on yourself, dump it on somebody else. Because that's what it's there for. So that we get to share what it is to be human. Don't think it's for you. It's for the person who says to you, good morning, and you go, blah, 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 and then you can get rid of the whole thing. And they love it because they asked for it. That's what it's for. Second line, structuring. 63-2. These are people that don't know they have doubts until you question them. And then they're full of doubt. This is the classic paper tiger line. You know, you see them inside through their open window and you look inside and you see that they could be very inspiring, that they might have a good question. And of course, they don't necessarily. The other thing is that they're ignorant of all that and don't know that they doubt themselves until you bring it up. And then they doubt themselves. What they doubt is their ability to the establishment of a large framework through which achievement can be expanded and shared, compensating others for their contributions while maintaining control of direction. I mean, that's what they doubt they can do. You know, they really doubt that their question can really ever be of value until somebody tells them, oh, you ask good questions. I'm always saying that to 63s. Makes them feel good. The pressure to share one's doubts with others while still maintaining control. Sometimes it's very funny to me. Uranus and detriment. Instability and achievement that when in positions of authority leads to arrogance and the desire to keep others away from the center of power. There are people who get very disturbed if you try to change the way they question. In other words, you say to them, I have no answer because your question's wrong. And this is something that is very disturbing to the 63 too. Doubts and achievement that can lead to suspicion of others. Suspicious of others because what they're really challenging is your own nature. I mean, after all, a 63 can ask you a dumb question, but they ask it the right way because that's their genetic nature. I mean, you know right away it's a dumb question. And that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing. It's not like you can say to them, look, this is not a very good question. You know, why don't you turn this around? I mean, I have this game that I play. I'm a 4. So I know 63s in my life. So I'm always saying to people when they stick up their hand and I don't want to answer questions, you know, I always say to them, is it a really good one? You know, play this game. This is the whole thing with 63s, is that if you challenge their questioning, that's when they really can crumble. Right? And then they become very suspicious. And then they live with all of this anxiety that they don't even know whether they can share the question anymore. They get very paranoid because they think that everybody, you know, is going to see that there's something wrong with them because of the kind of question they're asking. 63s are very insecure. For an obvious reason. I mean, you know, if you're only the question and nothing else, you know, then there's all kinds of reason to be insecure because you're dealing with a collective channel which is inherently social, where you must share with the other. And a collective channel that is inherently critical. There is no circuit more critical than the logical circuit. I mean, logic eats you alive. They criticize you at every step. The question is criticized. The answer is criticized. The opinion is criticized. The details are criticized. There's nothing more argumentative in its nature than the logic process. Because if you actually find something that is logical, I don't know too many people around in the world today who will argue over 1 and 1 equaling 2. I mean, you know, I'm sure there are, by the way. The world has everything. However, most of us have gotten past that point of getting hostile over that because we have really come to grips with its inherent logic for all of us. How nice. Line 3, continuance. The dedication to the new beginning. Well, you know, in the third line, you got a new beginning. Dedication to the new beginning that insists on maintaining its achieved principles despite having to interact with those who have not attained such a state. Doubts that one can maintain one's principles when interacting with others. Now, you're getting a shift here. Again, the third line is always bringing you closer to the importance of the other. Lower trigram, you don't know that there's an answer at the other end. You don't know that. But in the third line, through trial and error, you keep on banging into all kinds of different answers. And of course, that is your learning curve in your process to recognize the possibility that there's an answer for your question. So this dedication to new beginnings. In the detriment, success at any price. The pressure to eliminate the doubt at any cost. Now, what that means is you have somebody who asks questions, doesn't want to hold on to the questions because they make them anxious that they need an answer, and they'll accept any answer. That's what happens to them. They'll accept any answer. And in accepting any answer, of course, it still will have to go through the logical process. And of course, often it doesn't stand up. But that is their trial and error process. This is the way they get rid of their own anxiety. What happens on one side, you just become anxious because you really are concerned that you don't know how to deal with the other. And in the detriment, you don't know how to deal with the other, so you just let go, let them give you the answer, and then you can move on. And you can get rid of that nagging question. There's a lot of 63s, for example. All of the head gates are often in therapies of one kind or another. Because there is all this anxiety, there is all this pressure. And when you come to a third line, you can see that this can lead to all kinds of confusion and deep doubts and suspicions in the collective process. Again, if you're living out your nature, if you know that that process in you does not have inner authority, it doesn't mean you stop it. It doesn't mean that it's ever going to stop being what it is, which is a question machine. Stupid before enlightenment and stupid after. It's still the same thing. But the moment that you don't give it inner authority, if you just allow it to be the background research information of your consciousness, and you allow your definition and your type and authority to guide you, then it will operate properly. The answer that you accept as the detriment in this third line is conditioned by who you're taking the answer from. The moment that you're going in as yourself, that's the moment that you're entering incorrectly. You will benefit from your error. You will benefit from your mistake. You'll benefit from your trial and error. And by the way, the doubt is natural. I tell all logic people, you will doubt until you die. That's not the point. The point is that when you are clear, that is when you have evidence that the answer is legitimate, let go of the doubt. That specific doubt. And go on with your doubting process. Because after all, that's the inspiration of the mental logical system. The upper trigram. In the upper trigram, in the fourth line, you have the capacity, the transpersonal capacity to externalize your questions, to externalize your doubts. And because you know that there is a gate at the other end, because you know there's a fourth gate, your concerns are now about the other. How do you select, how do you get the right cooperation for your doubt and your question to be answered? Memory. The detailed accounting of the achievement process, whose information base can prepare a new order for the future. That is, the pressure to explore the doubt in detail as a foundation for eventual formalization. To explore your question, to explore your doubt in detail. And the way they do that is that the fourth line is always going to have a lot of friends. Because fourth line, that's its nature. And it's going to have those friends that it can externalize its doubts to collectively. Doesn't mean it has to do it to all of them at once as if it was, Alcoholics Anonymous or something. But as part of the process of integrating with them, sharing that question and not accepting an answer until you've built up the detail of the responses to your question. This is like getting a second opinion when you go to a doctor. It's about not accepting at face value any given answer. Very healthy. Mars and detriment, a willingness to forget in the glow of victory with the possible price to be paid later. The pressure and the risk to forget the details when the doubts have been answered. In other words, here you go to somebody, they give you an answer that seems to fit, and you accept that. In other words, you've been able to externalize your question, get your answer, and you accept it. And of course, the whole thing about that is that it may be valid relatively, subjectively, but without other reference points, you can't really be certain. And the doubt will linger, even though it's a good answer. Doesn't mean it's a bad answer. The doubts will linger because it hasn't been substantiated. And again, the fourth line recognizes that the other side, that there are so many possibilities on the other side. So it realizes at one level that even though it has a good answer, there may be a better answer, and so forth. Remember that the collective is always concerned about the best. They want the best answer. When you get to the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of this fourth line, the cross changes, and the 35 and the 5 are replaced by the 45 and the 26. You have the 63, 64, 26, 45. And this is the juxtaposition cross of doubts. So obviously you have a fixed fate here. These are the lifelong doubters and questioners. And deeply fixed in that is a profile. Obviously they are very, very important to the logical scheme. We know how difficult it is for logic to access energy. And we know that it's essential that the logic process is continually challenged. And that challenge has to come from the 63rd gate and the 58th gate in the logic process. These gates that will release the direct pressure. The left angle cross is the cross of dominion, where doubts and confusion rule. And we start with the 63.5, and this is called affirmation. The Son exalted, the authority and sincerity of purpose to pursue the same values in the new beginning that it allowed it to transcend the old. The understanding that doubts are necessary and of value, but remember that this is the general heretic. It is never going to offer a question. It's never going to release its doubt until there is a crisis, that a new question, that a new solution is going to be necessary, and that in that crisis it's projected on the 63.5 that they're the ones that can be the inspiration. In other words, they're giving themselves time to work out whether or not that's a valuable question. And they're going to raise their doubt in a time of crisis. And of course, they can be very, very powerful because of that. They can raise their doubt that a formula that's at work in the collective, in society, isn't really logical and is not to the benefit of society. If they question the system in a moment of crisis under the projection of the other, that doubt, that question will have to be answered. This is where we get real heresy. The question can be really heretical. How did Mary do it? It is Sunday, after all. Some questions are really heretical. Mars and detriment, a tendency in triumph to pay lip service to such values. And given such leadership, these values will be reduced to nothing more than empty rituals, doubting one's very process despite understanding. Now, this happens a lot to the 5. In other words, that they have to sit and hold their doubt for a very long time. They have to wait always for that crisis where they can provide through the projection field their solution. If they can't, and they learn this quickly in life, that there are situations in which the projection field is calling them and they do not have the ability to fulfill the expectation, then they get to a stage where they're less likely to come off the farm for minor crises because they doubt in their ability to be able to have that kind of impact that can raise a question that will challenge the pattern. Heretics get burnt at the stake. You have to be careful about the questions and the doubts that you air. The 6th line, nostalgia. Now this is one of the things you'll notice if you look carefully at the 6th line of the 63 and the 64. In both of them there is a deep desire to be exactly the other collective process. In other words, the 6th line here would like to look backwards. And of course, logic is about the future. That is, logic operates out of the present and projects into the future based on stable patterns. And that the abstract is a collection of sequences from the past that we string together as our subjective history. So here's an attempt in the 6th line to try to be anti-logical. And of course, it's a root of illogic. Chaos theory. Chaos theory comes out of a 63-6 inspiration. Nostalgia. Jupiter exalted the good sense to avoid turning the previous struggle into an obsession, the logic of leaving old doubts behind. Now, it's logical to leave those old doubts behind. It's logical to leave the past behind. However, it's not easy to do. And what happens to the 63-6s is that they're the ones who, sitting on their hill, will tell you who asks and who has asked in the past the best questions. Pluto and detriment. Revolutionary nostalgia, illogic, and the potential obsession with old suspicions and doubts. Now this is a natural state for the 6th line here, to rise above the constant need to have their question answered because of the frustration inherent in that. And going up on the hill and simply examining the past, the doubts, the answers that have been available. Now, of course, if that's personalized and you take that into yourself, you've got a problem. You're really going to suffer under mental stress and anxiety. However, that's a great gift for putting outward. The way that question was answered was like this. Or the way that question was answered. In other words, they have this capacity of being able to recognize the value in other questions, rather than being concerned about answers for their own. When the question is really there, when there is a recognition of what is a question that is of value, what is a doubt that has to be answered that is of value, then you move to the 22nd gate and you move back into the individual process and you move back into the mutative process. More than that, you move into the field where mutation is socially transferred.